Hello and good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today at the Asia's Powerhouses of Risk webinar, jointly hosted by Asia Investor Group on Climate Change, AIGCC, and MSCI. My name is Firdaus Anwar, Senior Manager Utilities Engagement at AIGCC. Next slide, please. Before we start, some housekeeping announcements I would like to mention. We will record this webinar and we share the recording with all registered participants after the webinar. Please also feel free to ask questions using the Zoom Q&A box. Next slide, please. I would also like to put on an antitrust reminder. This webinar and report are not intended to facilitate or require collective decision-making regarding an investment. The session will not provide recommendations to investors to divest, vote in a particular way, or make any other investment decision. Investors are expected to continue making their own independent investment and strategic decisions. Attendees are reminded not to discuss, disclose, or exchange any competitively sensitive information in violation of antitrust and competition laws, rules, or regulations. Next slide, please. Asia's Powerhouses at Risk report is a report we, AIGCC, jointly published with MSCI Institute, released in November last year. The power sector in Asia, which holds 60% of global electricity generation capacity, is particularly vulnerable to worsening climate hazards. Floods, water stress, and extreme weather can disrupt energy generation and damage assets, with cascading impacts across sectors as power generation and supply interruptions are immediate and acute, with no substitutes available. Through our work in the Asian Utilities Engagement Program, AUEP, investors in AIGCC have been engaging 8 major power utilities in the region for the past 4 years. While we acknowledge that on climate mitigation, the sector is transitioning towards low-carbon energy sources, the impacts of climate-related physical hazards remain underestimated towards these companies. Following up this context, AIGCC has partnered with MSCI to analyze current and future exposure and potential physical risk losses across power generation assets of 11 power utility companies in Asia, and also assess each utility's risk management, governance, and capital allocation maturity with respect to physical risk and resilience. Next slide, please. Let's take a look at the agenda for today. Today's webinar is scheduled for an hour. We will start with a presentation by MSCI on the key findings of the analysis, followed by a presentation by AIGCC on the policy and governance context for adaptation and resilience planning, and followed by a discussion with an amazing lineup of panelists on translating these insights into actions for systemic resilience before the close. Next slide, please. So without further delay, let's hear about the findings of the analysis from Sejun Tan, Climate Risk Specialist at MSCI. Sejun, over to you.
Thank you, Firdaus. Hi, everyone. I'm Sejun. I'm a Climate Risk Specialist at MSCI, and I'll take you through the findings of the report. Now, before we talk the headline numbers, I'll quickly explain the framework and the language we're using. You would have heard keywords like hazard, exposure, vulnerability, and loss. All these aspects of physical risk are important and considered in our study. Meaning, for instance, we can understand which exact locations of a company are exposed to certain levels of floods, considering how susceptible that location or asset type is, and finally, the financial losses if it happens. So this equation ends ultimately with losses, which companies and investors are concerned about. Now, there are then 2 types of losses: business interruption and asset damage. Back to the topic here, for electric utilities, business interruption comes from the loss of revenue due to service outages or reduced generation capacity, while asset damage covers structural damage to power plants, machinery, capital, and the associated maintenance costs. Between these 2 impacts, asset damage is often insurable and recoverable. However, the impact of business interruption is often more acute. It's more felt directly. There's no substitutes to power supply. So it's an immediate threat to a utility's business model. Hence, we focus a bit more on business interruption today. Now, to make them comparable, we can analyze these losses over time and look at them on a yearly basis. And we can then rank companies in our study by the percentage impact they face today across a range of hazards as color-coded here in current day versus by 2050. Note that we use a high emissions climate scenario from the IPCC, equivalent to a 4-degree scenario, to simulate for the most physical risk impacts, as you see on the right. Adding both charts on the right together then, we see that across our sample of 11 companies, there was a 33% increase in yearly financial impact by 2050, which is our first major finding. We then see that business interruption impacts are higher than asset damage impacts, emphasizing this as a real threat for the sector as a whole. Within the 11 hazards assessed here, 2 in particular stand out. That's extreme heat in red and extreme precipitation in teal, together accounting for more than 3/4 of projected losses. Beyond that, we can also look to the brown and blue bars, where some utilities also face distinct exposures to hazards like river low flow and flooding. So that's finding 2 and 3. Lastly, we found that coal power plants accounted for the largest fraction of losses compared to other types due to their large share of output in the current fuel mix, but also due to their concentration in exposed areas. So that's the headlines, but let's go a bit into the aims and inputs of our study. In the next slide, going into the study, my colleague Xiao and I were not the first to analyze a sector associated with high physical risks, as the Asian Development Bank, the UNEP initiative have highlighted. We know, for instance, there have been many high-level studies on physical risks for the sector globally. We know there have been detailed risk assessments of companies and their key power plants in key regions as well. But this study rather bridges the gap by showing material risks, hotspots, and best practice at the regional level using a bottom-up approach. And this should ideally instigate even more detailed risk assessments to be done by individual utilities, investors, and policymakers. Now, with this aim, we focus then primarily on present-day power generation assets, taking 2,400 power plant locations from MSCI's geospatial database, the map here showing their distribution by fuel type. On the right, you can then see the breakdown of assets going into our study, which reflects the increasingly diversified green to fossil fuel ratios, although with fossil fuels still being the bedrock of power generation today. So that's the aim and basis of our study. Let's go into the location level to look at the findings. As many practitioners here would agree, sometimes there's too many climate hazards to assess or to make sense of. So a helpful way to make sense of this is by grouping them by common drivers. For example, extreme heat, river low flow, and wildfires tend to be driven by high temperatures and periods of low rainfall. If we then sum up their business interruption losses, you're essentially looking at the financial impacts of possibly correlated events, their impacts now, and their increase by 2050, which is what you see here. And what we can see is then there are certain heat-related hotspots today, like power plants in parts of Southeast Asia, India, and Central China, coded in purple or black in the left chart. And some of these power plants also see a high increase in impacts by 2050, naturally worth monitoring on both timescales. However, some power plants in Western India and in Japan see high increases where previously not seen, so these power plants are worth monitoring too. As a quick interpretation of the numbers in the scale you see, the fact that there's an expected 10% loss from business interruption today is extremely alarming. This means that for the most impacted assets in purple, they could risk losing a full year's worth of output in less than 10 years' time. So this is a huge drag to a power plant or company's output and productivity over time. Naturally, as climate worsens, this drag becomes more noticeable and pronounced by 2050. In this overall hazard group, extreme heat, of course, sees the highest impacts. It's most widespread by location and by power plant type, driving majority of losses, but also not to forget the other two hazards modeled here too. So we'll dive into the case for river low flow in the next slide. As a case study, we zoom into India. We know that due to low rainfall, India's hydroelectric power output dropped by 16% in 2024, the largest decline in 38 years. This is no surprise because hydropower plants depend on river flow to generate electricity, which in turn depends on rainfall. In fact, if we look to another type of power plants, so your thermal power plants, including fossil fuel fired, nuclear, geothermal, biomass, they can also be affected by river low flows too. They often rely on nearby sources of water, such as rivers, for ambient water cooling, and the inability of a nearby river to provide this means that a power plant might overheat or just cannot operate due to regulatory measures. Now then, looking at NTPC's key hydro and thermal power plants situated close to rivers, we project that in a very severe once in a 100-year event, we could easily see up to 300 days of consecutive river low flow, in some areas potentially 450. So that's extremely alarming. In such an extreme event, some power plants, as we've highlighted in a map, could see up to 100% of their annual output compromised by 2050. For companies and investors, of course, the water use efficiency practices by NTPC now look like a silver lining, but it still calls into question what degree of water-related dependency can be fully managed away. For policymakers, this becomes a wider problem of planning for reliable hydro generation, where falling back to fossil fuel generators could still mean some kind of impact, but more importantly, cause a backslide in the country's own climate targets. In the next slide, so now that we have the impacts of heat and water scarcity, what about the impacts of too much water? To understand this, we can use high spatial resolution models for coastal, fluvial, and pluvial floods, which are really just coastline, river, and rainfall related floods in simple speak. The results vary, of course. Firstly, given its rainfall related occurrence, 31% of power plants in our study are exposed to pluvial or rain related floods, generally resulting though in lower flood depths. So it's widespread but less damaging. Looking to coastal floods, however, only a small fraction of power plants in our study are exposed at 5%, but where these do happen, they cause much higher flood depths and much higher impacts, especially considering the concentration of power plants close to coastlines, like in Peninsular Malaysia, Korea, Indonesia, and so on. This is very important. Fluvial floods, being river-related, tend to be somewhere in the middle in terms of that described pattern. What does this mean for us, of course? For companies and investors, as the map highlights, we need to assess all possible flood types, but also understand the dominant flood type, as this determines the manifestation, the impact channels, and also should inform the primary adaptation specifications for a given site. For policymakers, the implication could be to focus on areas where the same flood type consistently features, and this could lead to immediate disaster planning and adaptation planning with relevant companies, but most importantly, on who might be responsible for what. So that's a case study we've shared for hazards driven by excess water, which is the second most material hazard group in our study. We also provide analysis of wind-related hazards and cold temperature-related hazards, but leaving them aside now for the sake of time. We highly encourage you to check that out. In the next slide, having established escalating impacts from physical risk, naturally, we look to adaptation plans and what an ideal one looks like. Some principles are, of course, clear and detailed disclosures, being targeted based on financial materiality, as we've just gone through, having an accountability mechanism, and also translating commitment into measurable action. Interestingly, if we organize these principles into order, we can arrive at an adaptation workflow, starting with the key pillars you see on the left, which are doing a risk assessment of exposure and vulnerability, that's pillar 1, then having governance and risk management processes to oversee and monitor that. Finally, implementing this and putting financial dollars behind that plan. We can also add further criteria to each pillar, such as, for instance, in pillar 1, the depth of the physical risk assessments. In criteria 1A, is this financially driven, but also is assessment done at a site level? But also, for example, in pillar 3, do we see any dollar costs dedicated to adaptation CapEx or OpEx? We explain the full reason behind each criteria in the report, but here you can reasonably only expect a company to plan for adaptation after it has done some initial assessment of itself. We can only expect a company to put dollars behind its commitment after it has weighed the financial impacts as well, which is why criteria 1A and 3C absolutely depend and speak to each other. Finally, in setting expectations, working with AIGCC, we developed a traffic light system for these companies. A green rating in this scorecard or approach reflects high expectations that we feel are feasible in an Asian context. Yellow rating reflects some ambiguity from the part of companies, and the red rating reflects no evidence or disclosures or having started on these exercises. Using this scorecard then to look at each company's public disclosures, like their climate, TCFD, sustainability reports, here's the results in the next slide. There's many ways to look at this. Ideally, if you want to see entire columns being green, then all 11 companies in our studies had gaps to fill. Some, like CLP Holdings and Power Assets, had fewer gaps, however. Looking vertically then, most companies have started on their physical risk assessments. They have then implemented some level of governance, but there is limited progress in their adaptation, implementation, and financial spending. This could be expected of a adaptation workflow, where the results here are indicative of the stage companies are generally at. But whether you're in the utility sector or beyond, we're keen to hear your thoughts and where exactly you see yourself sitting in the spectrum. Interestingly, all 8 AUEP companies have started physical risk assessments, which I think speaks to the amount of effort going into the work stream on the part of stewardship teams and companies alike. In our report, based on this table, we also call out a few best practices and gaps. Best practice across the sample include quite a high number of companies having done site-level risk assessments, 7 out of 11 to be precise. Such companies also tend to use strong climate parameters like a 4-degree climate scenario. This analysis spans multiple time horizons. Almost all companies in our study had board oversight of climate risk, and also a range and variety of adaptation measures were mentioned, spanning engineering solutions, monitoring and surveillance, and nature-based solutions. Areas for improvement were also greater standardization to be expected on financial impacts. There was no one way to arrive at financial impact numbers. Despite the prevalence of governments and policymakers in national adaptation plans, we don't really see that much policy engagement from companies directly to governments as well. And finally, of course, we don't see any dollar costs dedicated to CapEx or OpEx in adaptation. A few more points to note in this table. Firstly, you'll notice that there are many yellow ratings in Pillar 1, and I like to describe these as low-hanging fruits. So companies here may actually be using strong parameters, but they're not disclosing them, leading to ambiguity on the reader's part. However, we also see many red criteria, and these criteria tend to be the last per pillar. So think about the assessment outcomes, 1D, policy engagement 2B, as well as capital allocation 3C. These are coincidentally the same criteria that are looked to for even more credibility. So a lot more improvement could be seen here. Finally, in the last slide, understanding, of course, that good adaptation plans don't happen in isolation. These are often informed by a company's past experience, regulatory push, as well as expertise from other partners. Arguably, it took all of these forces to shape the adaptation disclosures of National Grid, a utility company based in the US in New York State. Theirs is an example of in-depth assessments, targeted measures, and operational and financial clarity. So for instance, if you look at this table, we can see that flood walls of a certain height will be constructed at which exact substations over a duration of 6 years and costing 28 million USD by project end. Naturally, these measures then become performance metrics updated towards company management and regulators, ensuring even better accountability. Now, we highly encourage you to check out the other 2 companies spotlighted in the report for best practice, such as CLP Holdings for their in-depth risk assessments and PowerCo New Zealand for their novel governance structure on physical risk. With this publication, I just want to softly conclude by saying, I think we as an industry, as a field, are ready to look at the financial impacts of physical risks, starting at the location level. We are ready to contextualize these impacts, how it materializes to a given sector, in this case, a critical and highly regulated electric utility sector. Adaptation in this context becomes a lot more meaningful then, and we need to be articulate in our expectations for adaptation measures, whether as companies, investors, or policymakers. And finally, while best practice is still evolving in Asia and globally, these best practices are often nearby, they are available, and they are very achievable, as I'm sure our panelists will highlight later. Thanks for your attention, and I'll now pass on to Anjali.
Thank you, Surgeon. I will just take about less than 10 minutes of your time to really talk through how investors have been sort of working through integrating these physical climate risk considerations, and particularly highlighting the work that we're doing on engaging with policymakers to sort of work together on creating systemic resilience in Asian markets. As many of you might know, the Asia Investor Group on Climate Change is a membership-based organization. We work with institutional investors, the likes of pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, asset managers. So we work with around 80 of them that are active around 11 Asian markets, managing over USD 40 trillion in assets under management. A majority of these members that we work with are quite interested in understanding how their portfolios in Asia are exposed to climate risks and vulnerabilities. So we have a specialized working group within AIGCC that has been in existence for about 5 years now, working closely with investors in enabling their understanding of tools and approaches to integrate physical climate risk considerations in portfolio management. And this has sort of translated to deeper engagements with corporates and policies in Asian markets. Next slide, please. This slide really shows how investors have been utilizing their stewardship capabilities to engage deeper with corporates in Asian markets to try and deep dive into risk assessments, but to also work closely with them on identifying resilience measures that they can take at their own asset business level, operational, supply chain level, but to also identify ways that they can communicate how policies can enable better corporate and business resilience as well. And so policymakers in Asian markets need to sort of identify ways to develop credible risk assessments, clear policy frameworks to communicate effectively with corporates on how resilience building can operate, but to also then work with institutional investors on developing project pipelines that work towards addressing these risks, identifying opportunities on resilient solutions, and enabling ways of capital flows to come into these markets to build systemic resilience. And AIGCC plays a key role in bringing these different stakeholders together to try and formulate these coordinated approaches across Asian markets that we are active in. Next slide, please. As both Firdaus and Surgeon mentioned in initial parts of this webinar, we have an Asian Utilities Engagement Program that engages with systemically important utilities across Asian markets for about 4 years now. This covers 8 utilities across 5 markets, and there are 5 high-level expectations that investors have in engaging with these corporates over time. It starts with high-level board recognition of the climate vulnerabilities of these companies and the need for high-level targets being set on climate risks and strategies towards achieving outcomes on climate specifically. And this enables companies to set clear decarbonization targets and strategies in the short term, medium term, and long term, supported by capital allocation. The objective here is to sort of help companies align these pathways with 1.5 degrees targets across Asian markets. We also want to see companies committing to disclose data on an annual basis aligned with international standards such as ISSB, so there can be frequent monitoring of progress and approaches that companies are taking. Fourthly, the approach on physical risk and resilience is really what the report being discussed today at the webinar really feeds into. The expectation here is for companies to really understand their physical risk exposure and develop strategies for cohesive resilience across their operations, supply chains, and assets as well. These expectations were sort of outlined a lot deeper in the MSCI report, which you can sort of take a look at. And then there's also a large expectation on companies to engage with policymakers to both understand how policies are working towards addressing climate risks, but to also work cohesively in identifying ways that policies can facilitate investments into both low carbon opportunities as well as resilience that will allow the achievement of net zero emissions and resilience by 2050 or sooner. The report there is an annual report that sort of highlights how engagements with these utilities have been progressing over time. The report for last year was just released last week, and so it highlights how the benchmarking for these companies have improved over time, but also interesting case studies on how companies have been able to improve performance on each of these metrics. Next slide, please. Investors have also set clear targets and approaches on how policymakers can enhance approaches on adaptation plans. This was sort of really done by identifying the approaches that policymakers across Asia have already been taking on adaptation policies and identifying gaps, but really identifying how you can develop a cohesive approach towards private sector financing of adaptation in Asian markets and what would really be required to enable that specific outcome. So we came up with a list of 7 recommendations that we are now using to actively engage with policymakers in Asian markets. And this is particularly important this year as several Asian markets are in the process of revising or creating a fresh adaptation plan that they will submit within the UNFCCC process. This includes countries like Singapore, Malaysia, India, Japan, and Korea, amongst others. So the expectation ranges from enhanced visibility of local level risks. The first 3 expectations really highlight that aspect. So the expectation is for countries to outline a consistent national view of physical climate risks. And most of the countries that we've analyzed in the report that's shown on the right actually does a good job of doing this already. Where there is a gap is on where countries are trying to develop a platform where they can sort of share some of these risk assessments with stakeholders that are quite crucial in working together with them on developing solutions implementation, such as financial institutions as well as corporates. So I would say around half of the countries that were analyzed are in the process of working towards a risk platform for sharing some of this data. The second expectation around basing adaptation plans on scenario analysis that ranges from a medium to high risk scenario. Most of the countries that we analyzed have these assessments in place. Where there is a gap here is really translating some of these assessments into sector pathways. Out of all of the 9 countries that were analyzed, only Japan actually does a sector assessment and a sector plan for translating some of the risk data into implementation. So we will be using the report that was discussed to really deep dive into how countries can really prepare for utility sector resilience that will be a part of their adaptation plan as well. The third element on ensuring corporate disclosure on physical risks, most of the Asian markets that we work with have plans in place for mandatory implementation. The objective here would be to now work closer with policymakers on bringing the deadline for mandatory implementation closer. I think out of the 9 markets highlighted, around 4 have timelines that's beyond 2026. And we're sort of trying to see if that timeline can be made earlier. The 4th and 5th one is on addressing social and interregional impacts. Out of the 9 countries that we assessed, half of the countries are prioritizing understanding the impact of physical risks on workforce, on societies, and looking at measures to sort of plug in those risks. The rest is still work in progress. So this is definitely an area that we are prioritizing. The 5th one on interregional effects being crucial to develop a cohesive adaptation plan. Again, Japan stands out as an example of a country that's trying to delve a bit deeper into understanding these risks better and plugging in measures into their adaptation plan to emphasize interregional effects and responses as well. And this is quite crucial, particularly when you sort of look at supply chains, which is crucial for utility sector resilience as well. So we will be emphasizing this in engaging with policymakers on building a cohesive adaptation plan going forward. The last one being on mechanisms to engage private sector. The expectation here is to sort of give the private sector more active roles on engaging on the adaptation plan itself, but to also look at action-oriented strategies on translating that into financing. There are a few examples in the report as well of countries that are developing platforms to showcase some of these project pipelines and work closer together with policymakers, but we're looking at scaling this up. Next slide, please. Beyond adaptation plans, we're seeing this also translate into relevant policies such as prudential regulations. The transition planning guidance that was put out by MAS clearly highlights the need for financial institutions to engage on physical risks with their companies. We're seeing mandatory ISSB policies. We're also seeing taxonomies that are being developed in the region clearly integrate adaptation aligned capex as well, which sort of gives more clarity on how you would achieve resilient infrastructure in Asian markets. Next slide, please. These are just sort of ways forward, particularly on systemic resilience for utility companies and policymakers. I will not delve a lot deeper into this, as this is already sort of covered by Surgeon, and I'm sure it would be covered by panelists in the session following. So with that, let me pass on to Jeffrey to take forward the panel session. Over to you, Jeffrey. Thank you.
Thank you, Anjali. And that was a really important framing on how utility level resilience is really intertwined with national adaptation planning and really highlighting the need for systemic interventions. So by way of introduction, my name is Jeffrey Tong. I'm policy analyst at AIGCC, and I'll be moderating this next panel. So over the next 30 minutes, we'll go beyond the report findings to discuss how physical climate risk is actually shaping corporate responses, insurance and underwriting, and investor stewardship in relation to electric utilities. And we're very excited to have three distinguished panelists join us today. Let me very briefly introduce them. We have Jane Ho, who is Head of Stewardship for Asia Pacific at BNP Paribas Asset Management, joining us from Singapore. We have Dr. Naika Meili, who is Climate Risk Specialist in the Underwriting Division at Swiss Re Corporate Solutions, also joining us from Singapore. And then last but not least, we have Umar Ashfaq, who is Research Director at the MSCI Institute, also joining us from New York. Thank you all for taking the time to join us today. A quick reminder to our audience as well, the Q&A box is open throughout. Please feel free to submit questions throughout the discussion, and then we'll address them towards the end. So let us perhaps begin by discussing some initial reactions to the report findings as Surgeon had outlined. The first question goes to Jane. Jane, you've spent some time engaging directly with utilities through AIGCC's Asia Utilities Engagement Program around the expectations that Anjali's mentioned earlier as well. Could you perhaps give a quick introduction of BNP Paribas Asset Management's role and priorities for stewardship and utilities engagement? And then as well, having engaged the sector across the years, what aspects of this report on physical risk exposure surprised you the most, and how do the findings compare with the conversations that you've had with utilities across Asia? Over to you, Jane.
Thanks, Jeffrey. And great to see so many of you here today on the webinar. It means that physical risk is really taking center stage alongside mitigation. So very quickly, BNP Paribas Asset Management is a European headquarter asset manager with over $1.5 trillion of asset under management. And stewardship is one of our key pillars for our sustainability strategy. We do believe it's a fiduciary duty to engage and influence portfolio holdings towards improved practices to generate more sustainable returns. And of course, climate is one of our key focus area. And hence, for us at BNP PAM, we have been involved with this Asian Utilities Engagement Program since its inception, and I co-lead on two of the focus companies, which are CLP and Tenaga, and we're very strong believers still in collaboration, particularly in terms of addressing systemic risks. So in terms of what surprised me from the report, I think one of the things is that companies from the same geolocation can have very different exposure and level of risk. And again, that's a very good point to engage companies on in terms of going forward. I do think that investors will not just be looking at, well, what are the scenario analysis, but also, well, what adaptive measures you're taking to kind of mitigate those risks. I think secondly, extreme heat as a top driver of losses is a little bit surprising to me. I think, I'm from Hong Kong, there's a lot of typhoons, flooding, etc. So been quite focused on those hazards. And also, what Surgeon mentioned just now in terms of grouping hazards together, I think is really interesting. And I think we ourselves as investors uplift our capacity, that also uplifts our conversation with companies going forward. In terms of how that relates to what conversations I've been having with utility companies, I do think that they are doing a lot more than what they are disclosing currently. So really encourage, improve disclosures, because for us as asset managers or investors more generally, we also need to look at the physical risk exposure in our portfolio. And so it is in the utility company's best interest to disclose what you're doing and what kind of mitigation or adaptive measures you are taking, because I know that many of them are already working with regulators and doing a lot more than what's currently being disclosed. So I'll pass it back to you, Jeffrey.
Thanks, Jane. I think what you've really observed in engagement and physical risk disclosures is also very tied to the insurance conversation, especially from the sector. So if I could just turn to Nika now. Nika, from Swiss Re's underwriting vantage point, so you're working with actual loss data from extreme weather events across Asia. And as insurance pricing increasingly reflects physical climate risk, how have utilities, from your point of view, been assessing their financial impacts due to physical risk exposures? Do you see that there's a rising concern among utilities today with premiums and insurability? And what do these earlier figures on the annual average loss tell us? What does the conversation with the power sector look like today? If you could sort of share some thoughts about that.
Yes, of course. Yes, of course. So yes, we clearly see a rising concern and awareness from the utility sector as well as corporates in the power sector on these physical climate risks. So we work with corporates that actually really screen all their assets, all their transmission lines as well, and as throughout also their value chain on what could be the impacts of the physical climate risk exposure they have. One thing I would like to mention, though, that we see a rise in losses from so-called climate-related hazards, even if we put climate change aside. And this is just because, in general, infrastructure can be developing much faster in highly exposed locations than otherwise. For example, there's some research showing that in East Asia, actually infrastructure increases 60% faster in high-risk flood zones than outside of these. So this really brings me to the next point, which is basically we need to screen our greenfield investments, or corporates need to screen their greenfield investments, because that's really where we can have the first leverage or make the first choice. You also asked me about my reaction to the average annual loss numbers. And my reaction was that actually these numbers are used very frequently from corporates in the power sector just to gather prioritizations, which are the top loss driving assets and the top loss driving perils, as we've just seen with Searchin as well. But then in a second stage, we really need to go on an asset by asset level. We need to look at the facilities and also look at the design. Is there already protection in place? And if not, what sort of adaptation strategies are needed to potentially reduce the losses? And this is really also where the corporates engage with the insurance companies in conversation, because we have specialists like risk engineers that can advise on such measures as well. Another point I would like to make is that when a loss actually occurs, and we have also seen this with Searchin as well beforehand, it's usually a higher intensity event, but less frequent. So meaning a 1 in 100-year flood event. And when that loss occurs, the losses are much, much larger than the annual average loss numbers. And we need to plan the adaptation, being it physical, financial, as well as human factors, according to these type of loss scenarios. So this is also really in a second stage where we talk with the corporates as well, and we see that they're concerned about this as well.
Thanks so much, Nika. I think the point about looking into top loss drivers at the asset level and then also factoring in the impacts of tail events are really crucial. And then also for utilities themselves, really taking steps to reduce risk at the facility level is an important one. So I think that's a great segue to our next topic on how companies are actually responding. And if I could bring in Umar here from the MSCI Institute. Umar, I understand that the MSCI Institute has a corporate resilience survey, and that found that 76% of companies actually have a framework for monitoring and managing physical risk, but far fewer are actually translating that into capital investment in resilience. Could you perhaps share key takeaways from the survey, and then also tell us how electric utilities as a sector compare against other sectors on resilience readiness?
Thank you, Jeffrey. So we'll start off with a little bit of a background on the survey. So we surveyed private and public companies across different geographies and countries. Close to 550 companies were surveyed. And the key thing that we wanted to understand is that what is it that companies are doing to build resilience to extreme weather events and risk. And we specifically chose industries with the highest risk exposure to extreme weather risk. And the second thing was we chose senior operations and finance experts, which comprised 80% of our respondents in the survey, to share with us what they're doing in terms of how they are preparing for physical risk events. And we deliberately wanted to not pose the question specifically to the chief sustainability officers or the sustainability teams, because we wanted to frame this as a operational response, as a business continuity challenge, and as an operational risk, to understand what it is that companies are doing in the here and now, understanding that the impacts have been felt. And this is something that some of our respondents were saying as well, that companies, and I'll go on to the takeaways now, that companies have recently that have been impacted by extreme weather events. We found that they're twice as likely to have completed infrastructure upgrades, which highlights how direct experience accelerates action. Another thing that stood out was that corporate physical risk horizons skew towards the short term, as most companies, close to 70% of them, said they assess risks that are likely to arise within 2 to 5 years. Now, this can be viewed both positively and negatively. One is it can be seen as a short-termism on the company's part, but on the flip side, companies are not relegating climate risk or physical risk due to climate to something that is far out in the horizon and is something that they will do something about, and they're only right now thinking about what they're going to do. Coming to your question on the utilities part of compared to the other peer set, utilities do appear to be better prepared than the broader peer set, and close to 60% of utilities that we surveyed have invested in hardening their infrastructure, and this compares to 44% of the companies surveyed overall who have invested in hardening their infrastructure. In terms of risk assessments as well, utilities had a higher proportion of companies that had conducted hazard-specific risks, and the hazards would be the storms, heat, extreme, and other extreme weather events.
Thanks, Umar. And a follow-up question on that. Are you seeing any best practices or examples of implementation where companies are actually looking beyond risk management towards value creation, and where are the most significant gaps that you see?
Yeah, so some of the things that really stood out to us was that more than 2/3 of the companies we surveyed cited increased investor interest and improved insurance terms as a result of their investments in operational resilience. And we wanted to probe deeper into this because it seemed like something that was too good to be true. And just investing in resilience how is that directly turning into a financial benefit for companies? And we spoke to a few different large infrastructure companies to probe deeper into this. And one of the companies that we spoke to gave us a lot of color on this, and they said that this is not just simply a question of investing in resilience and getting the financial benefits. In a lot of cases, insurance companies require you to harden your infrastructure before they'd even extend an offer of insuring your assets to you. So that was one. The other thing was that this is both a carrot and a stick approach, because companies are incentivized to invest in their hardening of the infrastructure assets, because without that, insurance may not even be a possibility. Another key takeaway that we had was that 80% of the respondents are conducting cost-benefit analysis for measures to reduce operational disruption, and a similar proportion is also considering whether risk reduction investments could improve insurance terms, reduce financing costs, or protect asset value. So it's not just something which is hinging on one thing, but it is multifaceted. In terms of actual investments, we've seen companies investing in a variety of different solutions, and those can be grouped together in three distinct categories, roughly: engineering, digital, as well as nature-based solutions. What we saw was that engineering solutions were the ones that were most prevalent, and the ones that were least prevalent were nature-based solutions. And in terms of what excites me the most are where advances in basically the tech and the digital solutions, where advances in technologies are expected to happen the most, and they're going to be really pushing the envelope when it comes to how companies may be implementing risk management solutions. Some things that pop out are like digital twins and simulations that a lot of companies have invested in. But more excitingly, there is a very large proportion of companies that are considering the implementation of such digital twin solutions. Another exciting thing about this digital solutions are that we looked at the median level of investment that is required for each of these solutions: engineering, nature-based, as well as digital. And digital had the least cost as well when you look at median costs required to implement a particular solution. Engineering solutions were predictably the most. And it was also sad to see that only 9% of the companies had already implemented nature-based solutions, which is something which I think a lot of us were rooting for.
Thanks, Umar. I think these are great examples and data points. If I could now turn to Jane from the investor stewardship perspective, what persistent gaps do you observe in how boards and managements are currently approaching physical risk, and what concrete actions should we expect utilities to take or prioritize?
Thanks, Jeff. Yeah, I'll try to be brief because I think a lot of these were mentioned maybe by Surgeon and Jali earlier. So I think none of them have outlined engagements on policy. I know they're doing it. So please outline how. And also capital allocation, because if you don't outline specifically the capital allocation into adaptation, then it's very hard for us to see how you're factoring that into your strategic planning overall, like the capital allocation into, as you transition from fossil, let's say, to renewables, how are you looking at that as part of your strategy? And then I think, of course, IFRS S2, as Anjali mentioned, is being rolled out across the region. So I think many are or have already done scenario analysis. But I think is really the specific measures that you're taking to enhance that resilience that has not so far been disclosed or shared or with stakeholders. So I think this report, for example, will give a lot of more information for us to engage with companies. And Agnes, I see your question. I think we can put that on the agenda for the next meeting. So I think that governance as well, to very clearly show that governance of both decarbonization and physical risk. It doesn't have to be the same person. Again, we don't really want to be too prescriptive, but to ensure that there is both and that they are interrelated and thought of together in planning. And just to give a very quick preview, that we are looking with AIGCC as investors to come up with investor expectations for Asian companies on physical risks and resilience. So looking forward to working on that this year. Thanks.
Thanks, Jane. And the great point that you've brought up on adaptation and resilience that really needs to be integrated as a core pillar of transition planning. I think that really ties to the next topic that we have. And the final topic is on systemic interventions and conditions that are further needed to scale that. So moving on right now, and perhaps first over to Nika. So from the insurance perspective, the role of insurance beyond conversations of risk quantification and coverage is starting to gain more attention. Could you elaborate on how insurance and reinsurance can work alongside investors and policymakers to support resilience planning? And as well, what are some specific best practice examples, or questions or data points should utilities be asking or engaging on? So over to Nika.
Sure. Yes. I mean, one way how I really see the sector being able to support resilience planning is because we actually have a wealth of data when it comes to natural catastrophe losses, because we have a global view on all these kind of weather-related perils and how they can lead to losses across many industries. We can also quite quickly see what are some newly emerging trends when it comes to, let's say, the renewable energy transition, renewable energy technologies. What are they vulnerable to? What sort of physical risk? And what are then the potential adaptation strategies that we can take to reduce this? So this brings me actually to my next best practice, or to the best practices right away, which is like for companies in the power sector or utilities, I really recommend to engage the conversation with insurance companies early on, because beyond risk transfer, they can give you advice on what are your exposures, right? What are potential adaptation strategies to really mitigate these exposures and risks as well? And lastly, I mentioned it all in the beginning as well, I would really go beyond just screening at the asset level of the power generation, but we also need to look at all the transmission lines and the transmission network pipelines and so on to really understand what is the resilience of the energy distribution system as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Nika. That point on integrating insurance early in the conversation, I think it's quite crucial, and thanks for bringing that up. And if I could turn to Jane from the investor's perspective, and drawing on your engagements with the AUEP and with Asian regulators, what systemic interventions or policy mechanisms are required to enable utilities to engage in resilience planning or more robust resilience planning and investments?
I think one is definitely, as Anjali alluded to earlier, working with the industry on how their national adaptation plan is going to fit into the corporate adaptation plan and vice versa. I mean, often these assets or supply chains are all interrelated. So as we know, a company itself cannot become fully resilient, right, without working with everyone around them and also with the government. So definitely much more of that. You know, we as investors are happy to be part of that group as well in terms of engagement and stakeholder engagement. And I think Anjali went a step further by asking for sector plans as well. And I think generally it would be good to have more information and science sharing. Often there's a little bit of sensitivity around you know, how at risk maybe places, but I think until we actually can see that risk and have that data, it's quite difficult to adapt to the right level or take the right approach, right? So I think maybe be more open to sharing, but spending more money into the science and also sharing that information. I think some regulators are quite sensitive on that. Yeah, so I think also, so obviously asking companies to give guidelines for companies to include physical climate risks into their transition planning, and also for investors, as we saw MAS has just done. Thanks.
Thanks, Jane. And we're already seeing some excellent questions come in through the Q&A box. I think let me bring a few to the panel now. I think there's a question on how can investors and insurers work together to provide incentives for corporates for climate adaptation, for example, in retrofitting or in new projects. I'm just wondering if Nika, would this be a question that you could answer?
Yeah, sure. I can give a first take on this. So in terms of incentive, I think in general also the insurance companies want to reduce the loss potential that is there at the site. So so basically we have specialized teams that really look at the facility in detail and then give risk recommendations, as Umar mentioned beforehand in the survey as well. So this is obviously a certain way of kind of like giving this information to the corporates that to implement into their plans to reduce what are potential losses in that case for them as well, and then for the insurance companies.
I mean, from our perspective, you know, and thinking about the ecosystem, we're always trying to see where the barriers are and how to, you know, overcome those barriers. So great to see, you know, Nika here today, you know, on all those policy roundtables, we've invited insurers to participate, key stakeholder, you know, in physical risks. So I think, and then, you know, from us, so definitely want to work together in terms of mapping of adaptation plans, etc. And then the other part in terms of actual incentive, like financially, I think it is very case by case. But you know, if we see these examples like Lingreet has done in terms of, you know, adapting and then getting a lower, you know, premium, we of course are very supportive to kind of promote this and roll it out across the industry to other companies, and encouraging Lingreet to do that again, you know, and further. So yeah, that's what we can do, right, as owners of these assets. Thanks.
Thanks. And I think there's another question as well on the role of nature-based solutions and how they actually relate to physical risk and infrastructure for the utility sector. I'm just thinking we could open this up if any panelists would like to jump in.
I don't know if Umar wants to jump in, because I also had the question when you said that, you know, digital and tech was the most exciting, and NBS was like less. But I think we also need to be careful around maladaptation, because with these kind of extreme events, like many, many years down the line, I don't know how that plays into it. So I'm also curious in terms of in your research, how you think about these relative solutions, and maybe for NICA as well. Thanks.
Yeah, so we've classified nature-based solutions as not like going beyond the mangrove and afforestation and reforestation. We're looking at vegetated stormwater systems, which is some of the things that companies are investing in, bioswales, rain gardens, green roofs, even to a certain extent, building biodiversity corridors, soil health programs to reduce flooding, erosion. In certain cases, like the textbook example of mangroves being the first barrier of protection against any coastal typhoons, flooding. I think that is that's like the textbook example that most people go towards. But other than that, there is a lot more that companies are doing in terms of implementing and using nature as is either as a physical barrier or as a way to ameliorate the impact of extreme weather events.
From our perspective, when it comes to nature, we don't just look at it in terms of like how we can reduce the physical impact at the site, but we actually also have a lot of corporates that look at like the dependency on nature as well. So more towards the TNFD approach and their impact on nature. So we do also see in Asia, there is a rising concern about this, and companies are using also data on digital twins to analyze their dependency on the state of nature as well.
Thanks. I think we have time for one last question on insurance coverage. I think there's a concern as well on the time horizon mismatch. There's a question there that insurance coverages are renewed every 1 to 2 years, yet energy or utilities firms are supposed to serve communities for a long term. I'm just wondering if NICA, you might like to address this or jump in.
Yes, of course. And I mean, that's exactly some points we have when we have conversation with utilities companies as well. And that's why they also screen for this this manifestation of climate change in this physical climate risks as well, because they're very aware that their infrastructure has very, very long time spans. They don't just need to know is the flood risk high now, is the wildfire risk high now, but how does it change with climate change? So they're very aware of this as well. And obviously, when we have conversation with them, we also look at, do they have adaptation strategies in plan or in plans for adaptation strategies to incorporate these long time horizons as well.
Thanks. I think we're at time for this session, but just before we close, I'd like to wrap up perhaps with a quick question to each of you, and perhaps starting from NICA, followed by Umar and then Jane. If you could share in 2 sentences, if you can, from your perspective, what is one key barrier and one enabler for systemic resilience and preparedness in the utility sector? Perhaps starting with NICA.
Yeah, so I think one barrier we're still seeing is that, especially when it comes to new technologies for the renewable energy generation, there's sometimes a lack of sharing of information, that technical information, for example, and that makes it hard to really estimate the risk and therefore plan the adaptation strategies to mitigate the risks, right? One key enablers I would really see is that we see much more awareness now also from corporates in the power sector, utilities, on these evolving physical climate risks. And with this, we see, okay, they start to think about adaptation plans, long-term strategies, and so on. So I think this awareness is really an enabler as well.
And over to Umar.
So in terms of a barrier, I think the inability to price in avoided losses and fiscal constraints, particularly for developing countries, and this may not be specific to utilities, but also the broader ecosystem in which they operate in, but they inevitably impact the companies that are operating within that region. So I think that's the biggest barrier. In terms of an enabler, I think advances in weather prediction, as well as advances in attribution analysis that allow events to be mapped to specific changes in the climate, help build companies a better business case for investing in adaptation.
Thanks, Umar. And finally, Jane.
Yeah, I think one barrier is definitely the sensitivity in terms of the information, and hence maybe stopping people from sharing fully what they're doing, or working with others. So I hope that people can become more open with that. And enablers definitely then on the flip side of that, stakeholder engagement, to understand better what everyone's doing respectively. Not limited to this sector.
Thanks. And thank you again, Jane, Nika, and Umar for this really insightful conversation. And what is clear is that closing some of these gaps will require systemic action and collaborative action across these stakeholders. So with that, I'll close the panel and hand back the time to Firdaus. Over to Firdaus.
Thank you, Jeffrey. So we've come to the end of the webinar. I hope the sessions today have given you a better idea of what Asia's Powerhouses at Risk report is all about, especially the need for power utility companies, policymakers, and investors to simultaneously address the systemic, operational, and financial risks posed by the escalating intensity and frequency of climate hazards. Again, here is the QR code to access the report. We at AIGCC, through the Asian Utilities Engagement Program, AUP, and the Physical Risk and Resilience Working Group will continue our work and engagement in this space. Next slide, please. Before we close, I'd like to briefly highlight the AIGC Summit 2026. We're delighted to be hosting our inaugural summit on 18 May in Singapore at the Marina Bay Sands. The summit will bring together senior decision makers from institutional investors, policymakers, and corporates to discuss how capital can be mobilized to support Asia's climate transition. Many of the themes we touch on today, including climate risks, energy transition, and investment implications for Asian major economies, will be explored in more depth through investor-led discussions and cross-sector dialogue. This will be an in-person event only, designed to enable direct engagement between investors and the policymakers and companies shaping the transition. The summit is also a partner event of Ecosperity Week 2026 by Temasek, taking place during that week in Singapore. If you're an institutional investor, policymaker, or corporate leader working in climate and transition finance, we'll be delighted to welcome you. You can find more details at aigcc.net/summit. Thank you again for joining today. I hope to see you on the next occasion. Thank you.